It began with a single word. Not a scream, not a plea, just one clipped syllable, crackling through the speaker of Lena Porter's phone at 3:47 p.m. on a warm October afternoon. Maya. The voice was unmistakable. It was Maya Ellis's, but strained, almost winded. Then came a sudden burst of static, the kind that prickles the skin. After that, nothing. For a moment, Lena sat frozen at her cluttered kitchen table, the phone still pressed to her ear. She glanced at the call log, half expecting it to be a dial from some far-flung hotel in South America, or maybe an accidental voice memo sent in the middle of the night. But the timestamp was clear. The call had lasted exactly 6 seconds, and it had come from deep within Florida's Everglades. Lena knew where Maya was supposed to be. She and Daniel Cross, Maya's boyfriend, had set out 3 days ago for what Maya had been calling a soul reset trip. They were planning to explore remote waterways by kayak, camp under stars no city light could touch, and photograph the ancient, tangled wetlands that Maya had been gushing about for weeks. Maya was used to off-grid travel. She had trekked through Chilean fjords without cell service for days, and once gone radio silent for a week in Nepal. But she always checked in when she could, and she never sounded like that. By the time Lena called back, the phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until evening that the weight of the silence settled on her. The Everglades, despite their beauty, had a way of swallowing people whole. Tourists lost their bearings. Boaters capsized in hidden currents. The swamp didn't care about your Instagram following or your emergency flares. Lena's fingers hovered over her contacts list, debating whether to call Daniel's number. She had always liked him, grounded, reliable, maybe even too careful for someone like Maya. But when she tapped his name, the call also went straight to voicemail. That was when the unease twisted into something sharper. Officer Brad Keaton knew the swamp better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. That evening, as he logged off from his patrol shift, he noticed Lena waiting for him outside the ranger station, arms folded, shoulders stiff. Her expression was caught somewhere between panic and embarrassment. "I think my friend's in trouble," she began. Keaton had heard it before. Sometimes it was a hiker overdue from a photography trip. Sometimes a fisherman who lost track of the sunset. Usually, they turned up with sunburns and wild stories about running into an alligator. But Lena's voice carried a tremor that made him pause. "When was the last time you heard from her?" he asked. "Today. She called me. Or I think she tried to." It cut off after a few seconds. "She's been out here with her boyfriend since Monday." Keaton's eyes narrowed. "And no check-in since then?" She shook her head. He glanced toward the dark silhouette of the swamp, its still water catching the last glints of daylight. "Phones don't work out there half the time," he said, though not entirely convincingly. "I know," Lena replied quickly, "but Maya would have tried. She knows I'd worry." Keaton studied her for a moment before motioning her inside the ranger station. Detective Rowan Hale arrived the next morning, summoned not by panic, but by the sort of nagging instinct law enforcement sometimes learned to trust more than hard evidence. Hale was tall, deliberate in his movements, with a habit of letting silence stretch longer than people were comfortable with. He listened as Keaton relayed the situation, his brow furrowing at the mention of the 6-second call. "Any GPS data?" Hale asked. "Closest we can get is a tower ping," Keaton said. "Puts her somewhere along the northern channels, but that's a lot of water to cover." Hale turned to Lena. "If she want to call you, it means something happened after that point. Phones don't just die mid-word." 2 days earlier, Eli Turner had seen them. He was out on his skiff, hauling in a stubborn net near the mangrove edge, when he spotted a bright red kayak drifting about 50 yards off. A man was in the rear seat, tall, dark-haired, wearing a sun-bleached cap, and a woman sat in front, snapping pictures with a sort of expensive camera Eli wouldn't dare bring near the swamp. They hadn't noticed him, but he noticed them. Outsiders were easy to spot. They looked at the water as if it were a painting, not a place that could turn on you. Eli swore later that the woman had been laughing. By Friday morning, search crews were mobilizing. The Everglades can feel endless when you're looking for something or someone small. The sawgrass stretches to the horizon. The air hums with unseen wings, and every patch of water looks the same. Lena stayed close to the command post, trying not to imagine the alternatives. She scrolled through Maya's social media, looking for clues. The last post was from Tuesday morning. A photo of sunlight filtering through cypress knees, captioned simply, "It's like stepping into another century." No one knew it then, but that caption would become the first breadcrumb in a trail that would lead to one of the strangest missing person cases the Everglades had seen in years. Because Maya, Ellis, and Daniel Cross had vanished, not in the middle of the storm, not while chasing some reckless adventure, but in the still, breath-holding calm of a swamp afternoon. And the only clue anyone had was a broken word Detective Rowan Hale had always trusted his instincts. In 20 years of chasing missing persons cases, they'd never steered him wrong. But standing at the mossy edge of the Everglades, listening to the stillness swallow every sound, he felt unsettled. Not the usual tension of a search gone cold, but something heavier, as though the swamp itself was holding its breath. The morning after Maya Ellis's disappearance, the official search party began its sweep. Airboats fanned out across the sawgrass plains, their engines churning the water into froth before fading back into silence. Officer Brad Keaton guided Hale toward the boat launch, his jaw tight. "I've seen people go missing out here," Brad said, stepping over a tangled root. "Tourists wander off the trails. Some make it out. Some don't. But Maya's different. Her pack was found zipped shut. No signs of an animal attack. No sign she even tried to get back." It didn't sit right with Hale either. Most lost hikers left a trail of desperate decisions. Half-eaten rations, dropped gear, footprints leading in circles. Maya had left nothing. It was as if she had stepped off the map and taken the path the swamp wanted her to take. By mid-morning, Lena Porter arrived. She looked exhausted. Her hair pulled into a loose braid, her camera bag slung across her shoulder. She had driven through the night after learning from Daniel that Maya had gone missing. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed Hale a printed map dotted with red marker pens. "These are the spots she planned to shoot for her blog," Lena said. "Mangrove Point, Cypress Hollow, and a few trails near the old ranger station. We had it all scheduled." Hale studied the map. The pins formed a loose triangle, each location about an hour apart on foot. But one spot, a remote boardwalk ending in an abandoned airboat dock, sat far outside the loop. Why was she going there? Hale asked. Lena hesitated. She wasn't. At least, she didn't tell me she was. They took the map to Daniel Cross, who sat on a folding chair near the ranger station, his phone resting face down on his knee. He looked pale, eyes ringed with dark circles. His voice clipped. "Maya didn't say anything about an abandoned dock," he said. "If she wanted shots by the water, there are safer spots. This place," he shook his head, "it's not even in season. The water's low. Nobody goes there." Except someone did. Brad cut in, leaning against the doorframe. "Yesterday morning, a fisherman saw movement near that dock." Daniel's eyes snapped up. "Who?" That led them to Eli Turner. The man was as much a part of the Everglades as the cypress and alligators. His skin was weathered, his hair silver, his hands calloused from decades of casting nets. When Hale found him repairing a boat at the edge of a narrow canal, Eli barely looked up. "You're the detective," Eli said. "I heard you were poking around." Hale explained what they knew. Eli listened without interrupting, though his brow furrowed at the mention of the abandoned dock. "Saw her out there," Eli finally said, "day before she vanished, standing at the end of the boardwalk, staring into the water like it had something to tell her." Hale waited. Was she alone? Eli's gaze shifted toward the dark channel beside them, far as I could tell. But I didn't stick around. That place makes the skin crawl off your bones. Back at the dock, Hale saw what Eli meant. The structure was little more than splintered boards and rusting bolts, its posts sinking into brackish water. Mangrove roots clawed up from the depths, twisting together like skeletal fingers. The silence here was heavier than anywhere else. No bird song, no ripple of fish. Just stillness. Hale crouched near the end of the dock and saw faint scuff marks, like the edge of a boot had dragged against the wood. He took a photo, then noticed something else. A scrap of bright orange fabric snagged on a nail. It was the same shade as the windbreaker Maya had worn in her last Instagram post. Brad stood a few feet back, arms crossed. If she came out here alone, she came for a reason. Nobody stumbles on this place. Hale pocketed the fabric, or someone brought her here. That night, Hale returned to his motel room and spread the evidence on the bed. The map, the fabric, photos of the scuff marks. He replayed Eli's words in his head, staring into the water like it had something to tell her. He pulled up Maya's social media accounts, scrolling through weeks of photos. There were smiling selfies, wide-angle shots of swamp sunsets, close-ups of rare orchids. But in the last 3 days before she vanished, her captions had changed. No more hashtags about adventure or beauty, just cryptic lines. Some places hold more than history. The water remembers. Tomorrow, I'll see for myself. Hale felt a knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't a random disappearance. Maya had been drawn here, and whatever she was looking for, she kept it from everyone she knew. The next morning, Hale arranged to meet Lena before the search resumed. She brought her laptop, pulling up an unposted batch of photos from their last trip together. As she clicked through them, Hale noticed one image, a grainy, zoomed-in shot of figure on the dock. "That's her," Lena said quietly. "But look at the shadow in the water." Hale leaned closer. At first, it looked like nothing more than a trick of the light, dark shapes under the surface. But the more he stared, the more it resembled the outline of a person just beneath the ripples. "I didn't notice it until now," Lena whispered. "Do you think?" Hale raised a hand. "I think we need to find out what she was looking at, and we need to do it before the water swallows the answer." As they prepared to head back into the swamp, clouds rolled in from the east, heavy and low. The air grew thick, the kind of oppressive heat that made breathing feel like work. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, and for the first time since Maya disappeared, Hale felt the faintest pulse of urgency. The Everglades weren't just holding secrets. They were closing in. If you've been hooked so far, there's more, so much more, you haven't heard yet. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next twist in the story or the next one I uncover. The Everglades had a way of making time stretch and twist. By the third day of Maya's disappearance, the edges of reality blurred for those searching. The air itself felt heavy with secrets, and the slow-moving water seemed to swallow sound, as if the swamp didn't want to give her back. Detective Rowan Hale stood at the edge of a narrow boat ramp, watching ripples fan outward from a drifting lily pad. His notepad was already filled with sketches of the area, notes on the currents and possible points of entry and exit. Years on homicide cases had taught him that landscapes, like people, had personalities, and this place was evasive, the kind that liked to hide its sins deep beneath mud and roots. Officer Brad Keaton walked up behind him, boots scuffing the damp concrete. "Dive, team's got the sonar set up." "No hits yet," he said, rubbing his jaw. His eyes scanned the mangroves like a man scanning a crowd for a familiar face. Rowan glanced toward the water. "Out here, no hits means either there's nothing or it's just out of reach." Brad shifted uncomfortably. "Eli Turner swears he saw her kayak near Plover's Bend the morning after she was supposed to head home. Could be nothing. Could be someone else. Eli, he's a good fisherman, but not the best with dates." Rowan flipped a page in his notebook. "Then I'll talk to him myself." Eli Turner's shack sat on stilts above the slow green water, reachable only by boat. The place smelled faintly of brine, fish oil, and would long soaked by rain. Eli was perched on his porch in a folding chair, mending a net with hands as rough as the rope itself. "She was moving too fast for this part of the river," Eli said without looking up. "Not like a tourist paddling, slow and talking pictures. More like someone trying to get somewhere quick." Rowan leaned on the porch railing. "Alone, far as I saw. But the light was just coming up. Sun makes shadows play tricks out here." Eli finally looked up, eyes pale and sharp. "She was heading into what we call Blackwater Cut. You know what's in there?" Rowan didn't answer. "Trouble," Eli said simply, as if the word carried weight enough to sink a boat. "That stretch floods fast. Narrow. And there's things out there you don't want to meet. People, too." Brad, standing behind Rowan, spoke up, We've checked Blackwater Cut before. Not like I know it, Eli countered. There's places off that cut where the water's black for a reason. Swallows you whole. Later that afternoon, Rowan, Brad, and 2 search team members entered Blackwater Cut by airboat. The sound of the engine shattered the stillness until Brad cut the throttle, letting the craft glide between the tangled mangroves. The air was thick with a hum of insects, and long curtains of Spanish moss brushed the water's surface like fingers. They found the first clue half a mile in, a floating dry bag snagged on a root. Inside, a folded windbreaker, a cracked phone case, and a waterproof notebook with the initials Emmy in neat, blocky letters. Brad cursed under his breath. Could have floated from anywhere, but Rowan knew better. The notebook's edges were too clean for long exposure, and on one page, smudged but still legible, was a scrawled sentence. "If I don't make it back, tell Lena." The words trailed off in a blur of ink. By sunset, the team reached a point where the mangroves grew so thick the airboat couldn't pass. They continued in 2 small John boats, paddling through water that looked more like oil than river. It was here that Rowan noticed the silence. No bird calls. No splash of fish. Just a faint drip of condensation falling from leaves. And then Brad froze. "There," he whispered, pointing. Half submerged in the water was a kayak, its hull a pale orange that seemed unnaturally bright against the black surface. The bow was wedged under a root, tethered by a frayed strap. Scratches ran along one side, deep and jagged, like claw marks, though Rowan knew no gator left marks quite like those. The kayak was empty. Rowan reached out and steadied it as Brad pulled it free. Inside lay a single paddle, snapped in half. Brad's voice was low. "This isn't from hitting rocks." Rowan glanced at him. "No, it's from a fight." Back at the dock, under the wan yellow glow of a floodlight, Rowan examined the broken paddle. On the blade was a smear of something dark, not quite mud, not quite blood. He'd sent it to the lab, but his gut told him it mattered. "Whatever happened," Brad said quietly, "she didn't just get lost. Someone was with her." Rowan didn't reply. His eyes drifted to the black water beyond the ramp, where the ripples were already swallowing the day's clues. In the Everglades, the water didn't just keep its secrets. It decided when or if it would give them. The coroner's van had come and gone before sunrise, leaving the air in the morgue thick with a metallic tang of disinfectant. Detective Elias Moran stood at the viewing table, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the shrouded form in front of him. The sheet concealed everything but the sense of violence, still clinging to the body beneath it. Dr. Sylvia Hargreaves, the county's medical examiner, rolled back the cloth just enough to reveal the throat. The skin bore a curious discoloration, not a bruise, not quite a burn. A faint shimmer caught in the fluorescent light, like powdered glass. "Microscopic particles embedded under the dermis," she murmured. "Almost crystalline." Elias frowned. "From the environment?" She shook her head. "Too uniform. Too pure. I've only seen something like this once, years ago, and it wasn't in nature. Whoever did this left a signature." The weight of her words sank in. Signatures weren't accidents. They were the fingerprints of killers who wanted to be remembered. Hours later, back at the station, Elias set the photographs on his desk and stared at them. The grainy sparkle in the skin seemed to mock him. Somewhere in his memory, it tugged at a loose thread, but he couldn't quite pull it free. The missing hikers, the isolated woodland, the strange trace, none of it fit the pattern of a random killing. If this was connected to other cases, they weren't in his jurisdiction yet. When the preliminary lab report came in, it confirmed Hargreaves' suspicion. The particles were a rare industrial byproduct, something produced in only a handful of facilities across the country. And in Elias's county, there was just one, an abandoned glassworks plant on the far side of Brindle Creek. The building had been shuttered for over 20 years after a furnace explosion killed 3 workers. Locals swore it was haunted. Teenagers dared each other to spend the night inside, but most never made it past the rusting gate. Elias didn't believe in ghosts. He did, however, believe in patterns, and killers who liked to hide in plain sight. That afternoon, he drove out to Brindle Creek. The glassworks loomed like a mausoleum, its windows gaping black, its brick walls mottled with moss. The air was still, save for the distant drip of water and the rustle of something unseen moving through the rafters. Inside, the place was a ruin of twisted metal and shattered panes. Yet in one corner, someone had cleared the debris to create a narrow path. It led deeper into shadows, toward the old furnace room. That's when Elias saw it. An odd patch of floor dusted with the same glittering particles from the victim's neck. The trail was faint, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. He followed it to the far wall, where the bricks didn't quite match. Some were cleaner, newer, their mortar fresh. A crude repair job. But why here, in a place no one used? Pressing his ear to the bricks, he thought he heard something. Not quite a voice, not quite machine. A low, rhythmic thud, almost like breathing. Back at the precinct, he filed a request for a warrant to break open the wall. But before it could be processed, his phone rang. It was Hargreaves. "You need to come back to the morgue," she said, her voice tight. "There's something else you should see." When Elias arrived, she led him to the autopsy table, where the victim's fingernails had been placed under magnification. "There was blood under the nails," she said. "Not theirs. And here's the strange part. This DNA is a match for someone who's been dead for over 15 years. The room seemed to close in around him. Elias wasn't easily rattled, but the implication was clear. Either the records were wrong, or someone had brought a ghost back to life. He looked at the glinting particles in the evidence tray and thought of the trail in the glassworks furnace room. Maybe the killer wasn't hiding in plain sight. Maybe the killer was buried there, and somehow still walking. Detective Elena Marlowe didn't need to be a profiler to know when a man was lying. But with Carter Hensley, it wasn't the lie itself that unsettled her. It was how little effort he put into covering it. He sat in the cramped interview room, posture relaxed, hands folded neatly in front of him, like this was just another small-town coffee chat. On the table between them sat the evidence bag containing the Polaroid. The blurred image of room, bare concrete, with a single metal chair bolted to the floor. "This is yours?" she asked. Carter smiled faintly. Never seen it before. It was the same answer he'd given the first 3 times. No change in tone. No flicker of nerves. No fidget. Like the truth was irrelevant here. Elena leaned forward. "You know, when I first came here, I thought the story was about your missing neighbor, Miss Holloway. But then I started seeing threads that didn't match. Threads that all lead back to you." Carter's gaze didn't shift. That's the problem with threads. Detective. Pull too hard, and sometimes the whole thing comes apart. She didn't reply, just let the silence stretch until it began to feel heavier than the air itself. When Elena left the station, dusk had already swallowed most of the sky. Her car idled in the gravel lot while she studied the map in her lap. The Polaroid had been found in a shoebox at the back of Miss Holloway's closet. One box among dozens, all filled with decades of photographs. Only this one was different. Only this one had him in the background, barely visible in the grainy blur. Carter stood in the corner of that concrete room, half-shadowed, head tilted toward the camera as though he'd been caught mid-step. No one had ever explained what the room was, or why Miss Holloway would have a photo of it. She decided not to go home. Instead, she drove to the northern edge of town, where the railroad tracks split into 3 directions. The houses here were smaller, paint peeling, windows clouded with years of dust. This was where people stopped asking questions. An old man sat on a porch, a cigarette burning down to the filter. His eyes followed her until she stopped the car and walked up. "Evening," he rasped. "I'm looking for somewhere called the Hollow. Ring a bell." The cigarette trembled between his fingers. "Some things you don't go looking for, ma'am. Humor me." He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "It's not a place you find on a map. And if you do find it, you'd better hope it doesn't find you back." That night, Elena dreamed the photo. But in the dream, the room wasn't empty. Someone was in the chair, head drooping forward, wrists bound to the arms, the slow drip of water echoing off the concrete walls. When she woke, her phone was buzzing. It was Aaron Greaves. "Detective, we found something. You'd better come down to the lake." The lake was a sheet of still black glass under the morning mist. 2 uniformed officers stood by a half-submerged wooden crate. mud and algae clinging to its sides. Inside was a bundle wrapped in thick plastic. When they cut it open, the smell hit first. Sour, metallic, rotting. The remains were human. Female. A chain was looped around the bundle, threaded through the handles of the crate. A crude attempt at keeping it on the lake bottom. But what froze Elena wasn't the body. It was the object found wedged beneath the plastic. Another Polaroid. The same concrete room. This time, the photo was clearer. The chair was no longer empty. And Carter Hensley's shadow stretched across the floor. That evening, she went back to the station, evidence bag in hand. Carter was still there, still calm, still smiling. "Lake must have been cold this morning," he said before she even sat down. "You ever notice how some places keep things? Won't let go until they're ready?" Elena studied him. "You're not even trying to hide it anymore, are you?" He tilted his head, mock curious. "Hide what?" She slid the new Polaroid across the table. His eyes flicked to it. And for the first time, something changed. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in a smile, but in something closer to irritation. "That's not me," he said quietly, but she could see it in his face. It wasn't denial. It was ownership. Later, while logging the evidence, Elena noticed something she'd missed before, a faint shape on the wall in the background of the photo. It wasn't graffiti. It was a handprint, small, feminine, pressed into the concrete, as though it had been left there in a desperate attempt to say, "I was here." And beneath it, scrawled in thin, uneven letters, "Not the first." The words wouldn't leave her. Not the first. If the victim in the lake wasn't the first, then how many others? And how many more Polaroids were out there, hidden in closets, in shoeboxes, in the corners of forgotten basements? She thought of the old man on the porch, his warning about the hollow. She thought of Carter's expression when he saw the second photograph. And she realized something chilling. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He was afraid of something else. Something that might still be out there. The drive to Victor Hollow's residence was like crossing into another century. The rain had slowed to a mist, just enough to lay a thin sheen on the winding asphalt. The trees pressed closer here, their trunks dark with moisture, the skeletal arms of their branches rattling in the breeze. Detective Eleanor Voss had been to plenty of crime scenes, some grotesque, some barren, but she had never pulled up to a house that felt like it was waiting for her. The place loomed from behind a rusted iron gate, its brickwork scarred by age, ivy crawling over the windows as if trying to hide whatever was inside. The gate creaked when the patrolman swung it open. A shiver traced Eleanor's spine, though she told herself it was a damp. "Place is something, isn't it?" the officer muttered, his voice low, almost reverent. "Something," Eleanor replied, her eyes fixed on the windows. Every one of them was dark. The front door didn't so much open as retreat. Inside, the air was dense, like the house had been holding its breath for years. The foyer's marble floor was veined with grime, the chandelier above coated in dust, each crystal drop catching the dim light like a tear. Victor Hollow was waiting in the study, or rather, his body was. The man was slumped in a leather armchair, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to a sound only he could hear. His face was calm, disturbingly calm for someone dead. A neat glass of brandy sat beside him on a small table, untouched. "No signs of struggle," the coroner murmured, examining him. Could have been natural causes. But he trailed off, pointing to the faint smear of grayish dust on Victor's collarbone. Eleanor leaned in. The dust looked like the same strange residue found in the previous victim's belongings. Fine, almost metallic. She didn't touch it. "Any sign of forced entry?" she asked. The responding officer shook his head. Doors locked. Windows latched. It's like he just sat down and decided to stop living. Eleanor glanced around the study. Shelves lined with books, their spines faded. An old desk covered in paper and ink stains. And on the far wall, a painting. It was an oil portrait of a woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed almost alive. The artist had captured her mid-smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not Victor's wife," the officer said quietly. "She died before this was painted. That's someone else." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. She'd seen this woman before, not in person, but in a photograph from the first case file. The unidentified woman seen speaking to one of the earlier victims days before they vanished. Her mind began threading the timeline together. If this woman had been connected to multiple victims, then Victor's death wasn't an accident. And she wasn't working alone. Someone was helping her move freely, slipping past locked doors, leaving no trace except that peculiar dust. As Eleanor's team photographed the scene, she wandered deeper into the house, following a low hum she almost thought she imagined. It led her to a locked door at the end of the hall. The wood was different here, newer, as though replaced recently. She tried the handle. It turned, but something heavy blocked it from the other side. She pressed her ear to the door. The hum grew clearer. It wasn't machinery. It was breathing. Eleanor stepped back, adrenaline surging. "Get me a crowbar," she ordered. 2 minutes later, the door splintered inward, the smell hitting her first, a sour, metallic tang that made her throat tighten. The room was small, windowless, its only light a bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. Against the far wall sat a wooden chair, its arms fitted with leather restraints. And in that chair, slumped forward, was another body. But this one wasn't dead. The figure lifted its head slowly, eyes wide and glassy, a faint tremor running through their frame. Their lips parted, but the sound that came out was barely human, hoarse, strained, like they hadn't spoken in months. Eleanor's breath caught. This wasn't just another victim. This was someone who'd been missing for over a year, presumed dead, their case long gone cold. And pinned to their chest, secured with a single silver tack, was a photograph of Detective Eleanor Voss. Standing outside her own apartment, Detective Aidan Crow stood in the cramped evidence room, the hum of the fluorescent light above him just loud enough to be irritating. The place smelled faintly of mildew and dust, a scent that clung to the manila folders stacked on rusted metal shelves. The town's entire criminal history was here. 30 years' worth of reports, photographs, and sealed envelopes. He hadn't planned to be here that morning. In fact, his orders from Captain Voss were to focus on re-interviewing the witnesses from a night of Eleanor's disappearance. But there was something about Elias Harrow's expression yesterday, something tight and guarded, that gnawed at him. When Elias had spoken of the last place he saw her, his words had been careful, measured, not the unfiltered grief of a man desperate to find the missing woman he'd once claimed to love. Crow pulled a box labeled Miscellaneous, 1990 to 2000 from the third shelf. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, only that his gut told him answers weren't going to come from the neatly typed witness statements in Eleanor's file. They would come from something older, stranger, something the official record had no use for. Inside, the box was a jumble of unrelated debris, an unclaimed wallet, photographs of long-demolished buildings, a set of rusted keys with no tag. Beneath these was a rolled-up sheet of thick parchment, bound with fraying twine. When Crow undid it, dust cascaded onto the table in a soft cloud. It was a map, not a town planning chart, not a tourist trail guide, but a hand-drawn rendering of the surrounding forest. The ink had bled into the paper over time, but the landmarks were unmistakable. The ridges, the river, the abandoned logging road. But what made his skin tighten was a series of small red X's scattered across the terrain. There were 12 of them, and written beside one, deep in the hollow where the forest dipped like a scar, were 3 words in faded graphite. "She sleeps here." Crow's breath caught. He cross-referenced the coordinates in his mind, tracing the jagged river bend, the fork in the trail. That marked location. It was nowhere near the official search grid, nowhere near the spot Elias had claimed to have last seen her. This was a lead that couldn't wait. By dusk, he was in the forest, the map folded into the inside pocket of his coat. The air was colder here, carrying the kind of damp that clung to bone. Every step on the narrow path released a faint crunch of frostbitten leaves. As he moved deeper, the trees seemed to close in, their skeletal branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the last of the light. The silence was unsettling. No wind, no rustle of wildlife, just the soft, deliberate sound of his boots pressing into the earth. The red X's were crude, but he had memorized their rough alignment. The closer he came to the hollow, the more the forest changed. The air smelled faintly metallic. Moss on the trunks darkened to a near black. It was a kind of shift you felt in your chest before you registered it in your eyes. And then he saw it. A stone marker, half buried under years of moss and leaf litter. It wasn't a headstone, not exactly. Just a roughly hewn slab with an uneven surface. Carved into it, barely visible in the dying light, was a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle intersected by 3 sharp lines. Crow crouched, brushing the moss aside. The ground here felt wrong, looser, as if it had been disturbed at some point in the past. A wave of unease passed over him. It wasn't the logical kind of fear you felt when you thought you were being followed. It was the primal kind that whispered in your skull, "Don't be here." Still, he dug. The compact spade in his satchel bit into the earth, easily at first, then struck something solid with a muted thud. He cleared the dirt, revealing a small, rusted tin box. The hinges protested as he pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were photographs. The kind you'd expect from the 1990s, grainy, slightly overexposed. The first few were unremarkable. The logging road, a stream, a cluster of pines. But as he flipped through, his hand slowed. There was Eleanor, not in the dress she'd been wearing the night she vanished, but in an older outfit, a sweater he recognized from her college days. She wasn't smiling. She was standing in front of this very stone marker. Her expression was vacant, her eyes unfocused, like she'd been caught mid-thought or mid-fear. The next photo chilled him further. It was of her again, but taken from a distance. She was in the forest at night. Her back turned, a lantern casting a pool of yellow light around her feet. And in the final image, Crow froze. It was Elias Harrow. Younger, maybe by 15 years, but unmistakable. He was standing beside Eleanor, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that looked less protective and more possessive. His eyes met the camera lens directly, as if he knew exactly who was behind it. And he was smiling. Crow's instincts screamed at him to get out. He stuffed the photos back into the tin, slid it into his coat, and began the trek back. But the forest didn't seem as empty as before. The silence felt heavier, like it was pressing against his eardrums. Somewhere behind him, twigs snapped in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't turn around. By the time he reached the main trail, the last light had bled from the horizon. He was breathing harder than the hike warranted, his hand never leaving the inside pocket where the tin box rested. One thought repeated in his head, as unshakable as the pounding of his pulse. If Elias had lied about where he last saw Eleanor, what else had he lied about? And why? After all these years, was there a map in the evidence room that the department never logged? By the time Detective Mara Klein turned onto Blackwood Road, the world felt as though it had narrowed to a single, suffocating point. The air had that quiet before a storm, dense, charged, unnatural. The house loomed ahead, crouched low against the tree line, its black-shuttered windows catching what little light the late afternoon offered and swallowing a whole. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about it. Peeling paint, a front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. But Mara knew better. She knew this was where Nathan Cole had been living before the night Elias vanished. She also knew, though the evidence file didn't say out loud, that 3 other missing persons reports had threads that brushed up against this very address. The front door gave under her push, hinges moaning in protest. The smell hit first, mildew, damp earth, and something sharper underneath. She pulled a sleeve over her nose, stepping inside. The hallway was cramped, lined with faded floral wallpaper that had begun to curl at the edges. Each step forward was muffled by an old carpet runner, worn bald in places. On the left, a closed door. On the right, another, slightly ajar, revealing only the shadow of a room that didn't want to be disturbed. It was a kitchen that drew her deeper in. A single bulb swung slightly from the ceiling, as if it had been brushed moments before. The counters were cluttered with objects that didn't belong together, rusted tools, half-melted candles, a cracked porcelain doll, missing one eye. The refrigerator hummed too loudly, its sound jagged against the otherwise still air. Mara opened it. Inside, no food, just rows of neatly labeled glass jars, each filled with a fine, grayish powder. The labels were written in a tight, slanted script, numbers and dates that made no immediate sense. She snapped photos, her gut nodding with the certainty that this wasn't the first time she'd seen that handwriting. Her radio crackled. "Klein, you need to see this." Officer Radley's voice came through, strained. "Basement. Now." She followed his voice to a narrow door tucked behind the kitchen. It opened onto steep wooden steps, descending into shadow. The smell intensified, an acrid tang beneath the dampness, metallic and wrong. The basement wasn't large, but it was organized. Too organized. Against one wall, a workbench with carefully arranged instruments. Forceps, clamps, syringes. Along another, a set of heavy wooden crates stacked 3 high. Radley stood near the far corner, pale under the flickering bulb. At his feet was a trunk, its lock hung broken, as though forced open recently. Inside were stacks of old photographs. Mara crouched, lifting one. It was a group photo, 5 people, all smiling stiffly at the camera. In the back row, a younger Nathan Cole. In the front, a child whose face Mara recognized instantly, though she couldn't say from where. The rest of the photos were variations of the same. Different people, different years, all posed the same way, all with Nathan somewhere in the frame. Radley swallowed. "They're not just missing persons, are they?" Mara didn't answer. She kept sifting until she found one photo that made her blood go cold. It was taken on the edge of a forest. Elias, unmistakably Elias, stood in the center. Nathan had his hand on his shoulder, smiling that same unblinking smile. The date scrawled in the corner wasn't from last year. It was from 15 years ago. She stared at it, the edges of her vision tightening. That was impossible. Elias hadn't even been born then, at least not according to every record she'd seen. Behind her, something creaked. Both she and Radley spun around, flashlights slicing through the gloom. At the base of the stairs stood Nathan Cole. His clothes were caked in mud, his eyes black pits in the dim light. He didn't speak at first, just smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching upward, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "You're late," he said finally, his voice too calm. "I've been waiting to introduce you to the others." He stepped aside, and in the far corner, shadows began to move. Figures, 3, maybe 4, emerging just enough of the light to catch them. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, but it was their eyes that made Mara's breath hitch. She knew those eyes. They belonged to people she had only ever seen in cold case files. People declared dead years ago. For years, the town of Grafton had quietly lived with the mystery of Margaret Holloway's disappearance. But the truth, as the police were now learning, had been living right among them, wearing the face of a neighbor, a friend, even a confidant. When Detective Calder sat across from Peter Langford in the Stark interrogation room, he wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at the man who had baked pies at community fair, who had helped build the school's new library, who had, ironically, donated to the town's missing persons fund every year. But now, Calder knew all that generosity had been a mask, one carefully crafted to keep suspicion miles away. Peter didn't come to this table in cuffs. Not yet. The police were still pulling the strings, tightening them without letting him feel the full weight. But even as he sat there, hands folded, smiling faintly, there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew the game had changed. Calder didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We know Margaret trusted you. We know you were one of the last people to see her alive. And now, we know you lied about where you were that night." Peter tilted his head, as if trying to decide whether to laugh or act offended. "You're mistaken," he said calmly. "Margaret left my workshop around 9. I was home before 10. Ask anyone." "We did," Calder replied. "They remember you getting home. What they don't know is that you slipped back out an hour later." He slid a small evidence bag across the table. Inside was a single brass button, tarnished and old. Peter's eyes flicked to it for less than a second, but Calder caught it. "We found it in the root cellar of the property you've been quietly renting on the east side of town," Calder continued. "The same cellar where we found traces of Margaret's blood." The smile faltered. Peter leaned back in his chair, arms crossing, a defensive wall. "Blood? That's absurd." Calder didn't press. Instead, he let the silence stretch, filling the room like thick smoke. This was where suspects often tripped over their own words. And Peter, for all his careful calculation, was no exception. She was never supposed to suffer, Peter finally said, almost under his breath. His voice carried that odd mix of defensiveness and justification Calder had heard from too many predators before. You don't know her like I did. You don't know what she was planning. Calder's pen paused over his notepad. What was she planning, Peter? But Peter's eyes went cold. Doesn't matter now. While Peter clammed up, elsewhere in town, evidence technicians were combing through his workshop. It looked innocent at first, rows of tools neatly arranged, woodworking projects in progress, an antique clock on the back wall. But behind a false panel, they found something far darker, a box of old photographs. Each one was of Margaret, not stolen, candid shots from a distance, but intimate photos, her laughing in her garden, reading in the park, looking over her shoulder at the camera as if she'd been caught mid-conversation. The unsettling part? Many of these photos were taken in locations she would never have gone with Peter willingly. Detective Avery, working the scene, muttered, "This isn't a crush. This is possession." There were other items in the box, too. A silver locket belonging to Margaret, her monogrammed scarf, and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be Peter's writings. In it, he described not just Margaret's daily routines, but his beliefs about her destiny and how she needed to be protected from the world. To an outsider, it might read like the ramblings of an obsessive man. To Calder, it was a blueprint for abduction. The turning point came when forensics returned results on the blood found in the root cellar, a perfect match to Margaret. Not just surface traces, either. It was soaked into the floorboards. This wasn't a place she'd been briefly. This was where she'd been held. When confronted with the evidence, Peter didn't deny everything. Instead, he began rewriting the narrative, painting himself as a misunderstood savior. "She came to me," he insisted, eyes bright with strange conviction. "She told me she couldn't trust anyone else. She said the people she lived with, they were dangerous. I was the only one who could keep her safe." Calder kept his face neutral, but inside, his instinct screamed that Peter's version of events was nothing more than a self-serving distortion, a way to mask and control his kindness. "You kept her in a cellar," Calder said flatly. "You took her freedom. You cut her off from everyone she loved. That's not protection, that's a cage." Peter didn't flinch. Better a cage than a grave. Meanwhile, Margaret's surviving relatives, especially Claire, were left to process the horror. For years, Claire had clung to hope that Margaret might be living somewhere far away, free, maybe even happy. Now she had to face the reality that Margaret's final days had been spent in darkness, in fear, within walking distance of home. Claire's voice trembled when she spoke to the press. "He smiled at me. He asked me if I needed help putting up missing posters. He offered to search the woods with me. All that time, he knew exactly where she was." The community reacted with outrage and disbelief. How could someone they'd trusted, someone who seemed so woven into the fabric of the town, commit something so calculated and cruel? Yet, in small towns, predators like Peter often thrive precisely because no one suspected them. As investigators pieced together the final timeline, they realized the trap had been laid long before the night Margaret disappeared. Peter had slowly worked his way into her trust over months, maybe even years, learning her habits, her vulnerabilities, her fears. The night she vanished was not a crime of passion. It was a culmination of a plan that had been rehearsed in his mind countless times. And though the truth was now in the open, there was still one chilling question left unanswered. Why now? What had changed that made Peter finally act? Calder suspected the answer lay in the last few entries of Peter's notebook, scrawled lines about time running out and the window closing. But whether that meant Margaret had discovered his intentions, or if Peter believed some external force was at play, no one could say for certain. One thing was clear. The lies that had built this trap were not just about hiding a crime. They were about crafting an entire false reality, one that only Peter believed in. It was in that delusion that Margaret's fate had been sealed. The wind that night carried a strange mix of scents: rain-soaked cobblestone, coal smoke curling from chimney stacks, and the faint metallic tang that always seemed to linger near the East End docks. It was the smell of London breathing in the last days of autumn, heavy with secrets and damp with rot. Detective Elric Ward had never been the sort to indulge in superstition. Yet, as he walked the narrow back street toward the crumbling boarding house on Dorset Lane, he couldn't shake the sensation that the city itself had been conspiring to keep this case alive for him and only him. Every step felt drawn out, as if time itself were reluctant to carry him toward the truth. Inside, the old woman who had agreed to speak, Margaret Hale, sat hunched by a coal stove. Her hands trembled not from age, but from a memory she claimed had haunted her since 1888. She had been a young laundry worker then, barely 18, living in the thick of Whitechapel's chaos. Elric eased into the chair opposite her. "You sent word you had something new to tell me. Something you never told the police before." Her eyes darted to the rain-smeared window, then back to him. "I didn't dare, not then. And after what happened to the others, I knew speaking would put me in the ground." "You're saying you knew the Ripper?" "I saw him," she corrected, her voice cracking. "Not just his face. I saw what he carried, what he left behind." Elric leaned forward. "What did you see, Margaret?" Her lips trembled as she spoke. "The night Annie Chapman was killed, I was coming home late from the laundry. I took the long way round, past Hanbury Street. That's when I saw him standing under the gaslight. He was tall, well-dressed, with gloves that shone like wet leather. He had something tucked under his arm, looked like a small satchel. But here's the part I've never told. When he shifted, I saw a girl's hand slip out of it." Elric's stomach turned. "A severed hand?" "No, a living hand. She was alive. He wasn't just killing them. He was taking some away." The words hit him like a stone through glass. The entire narrative of the case, of the Ripper as a phantom who struck and vanished, suddenly bent in his mind. If Margaret was telling the truth, some of the women weren't just victims. They were captives. And if that was true, then how do you know she was alive? "She reached toward me," Margaret whispered, like she wanted me to take her away from him. But I froze. I couldn't move. And then he smiled at me. Not a normal smile. The kind that says, "I know you now. You're mine." Elric felt the weight of years settle on the room. This was a missing thread, the one that would explain the disappearances, the inconsistencies, the bodies that were never found. But there was one more question clawing at him. Why speak now after all this time? Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Because I saw him again. Last week. Same face. Same smile. Just older." The air in the room thickened. Elric felt a cold realization. If the man she saw in 1888 was still alive, then this wasn't just a closed chapter in London's history. It was an open wound. He pressed her for details, and she gave him in halting, gasping bursts. A man living under an assumed name in the outskirts of the city. A private workshop that never saw the light of day. A cart that rolled out only at night, always covered in tarpaulin. It was enough to move. By the time Elric and two constables reached the address, the workshop door hung open like a mouth mid-breath. The smell hit first. Sickly sweet, layered over musk of damp wood and rust. Inside, there were no corpses. Instead, there were rooms. Narrow, cell-like spaces lined with peeling wallpaper and furnished with nothing but a cot and a single chair. In one, a child's doll lay curled in a blanket, its glass eyes staring. In another, an iron shackle bolted to the wall. And in the farthest room, a journal. Its pages were dense, written in a steady, elegant hand. Dates stretched from 1887 to the present month. The entry spoke of projects, of preparing vessels, of preserving the most exquisite of them. It was less the diary of a killer, and more the ledger of a collector. The last entry chilled Elric to the bone. "Margaret Hale came to see me today. Still afraid, still mine." He looked back at the doorway, expecting to see her standing there. But Margaret was gone. No one had seen her leave. In the silence that followed, the rain against the workshop's roof seemed deafening. The case files of 1888 had always spoken of a shadow. But what Elric understood now was worse. The shadow had never gone. It had been living alongside the city all along, collecting, keeping, waiting. And somewhere out there, Margaret Hale, whether willing or not, was back in its grasp. London's wound was still open, and it bled in the dark. This case may be closed, but the shadows never stop moving. Subscribe now, because the next story I'm working on might just keep you up all night long.